Border walls. Did you ever notice that there are no border walls for white people? No border walls to restrict the movement of white people? Look around the world. There are no border walls to confine white people. Europe doesn't have border walls against its people. Canada doesn't have a border wall against the US, and the US government doesn't want a border wall against Canadians. Even supposedly pro-borders groups like the Minutemen, they don't support a border wall against Canada. But yet, many white people are in love with the idea of creating border walls against non-white people, most recently against Mexicans and Central Americans. And that's because all this talk of border walls is so that white people, European descent people, can freely occupy other people's lands and control the non-white races of those occupied lands. In fact, the last time white people had a significant border wall put up against them, Ronald Reagan, of all people, stood at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin and demanded, "Tear down this wall!" Reagan said that the Iron Curtain of Europe was wrong because it divided the continent. He said the border wall prevented freedom. He called the border wall a brutal division of the continent. He said the border wall was a scar. Nowhere around the world are there border walls to keep white people restricted. And yet it is the white people, the European descent people, who are the biggest supporters of border walls. That's because border walls are meant to keep the non-white races under the control of the white race, so that the white European descent people can enjoy the lands they have stolen after they left Europe. In other words, border walls as they exist today exist primarily to serve white people, the European colonists around the world. European descent borders and border walls preserve white privileges over the non-white populations of the world. That's why European descent people have been so eager to enforce their borders and border walls in the Bantustans of apartheid South Africa and along the US-Mexico border. White people, the European descent people, behave as if they have every right to trespass anyone's lands, regardless of their borders and border walls before white people were there. White people, they can just invade Iraq's borders and sovereignty. White people can invade and violate Iraq's borders and sovereignty, but then turn around and demand that their own white borders must be respected. White people take it for granted that they can move back and forth across the Mexican border to shop, to drink, and to piss on the sidewalk during spring break. But Mexicans must fill out lengthy paperwork, pay expensive fees, and ask for white permission to be allowed to cross the same Mexican border. Same border, different rules for different races. The rules have been drawn by European descent people to allow European colonist descendants to move freely on other people's lands, but the indigenous residents of those lands cannot move freely without white permission. Notice how European descent people never argue that they have no rights to violate the sacred borders of another nation, like Iraq, like Afghanistan. They just assume that they can give themselves the right to violently break into anyone's lands anytime they want to. And speaking of borders, isn't it interesting that white people don't put themselves on reservations? After all, they are the ones who have promoted reservations as being such a great idea. Europeans have forced non-whites onto reservations, reserves, and Bantustans around the world, from the Indian reservations to apartheid South Africa Bantustans, to Australian Aborigine reserves. But they don't force white people onto reservations and Bantustans. Why is that? And isn't it interesting that white people, European descent people, don't put up border walls between their own families, even though they are perfectly eager to do this to other non-white peoples? So you see, border walls exist for the benefit of the white race. They may not think of it that way, but look at these border walls. They don't slow white people down one bit. Whites are free to cross these border walls at will, as shown along the US-Mexico border. European descent people are even constructing new borders today within Iraq, partitioning off entire neighborhoods and families. Who gave them permission to do this? The same thing is being done in Israel, where a European-born Russian can move to Israel and demand to segregate the Arabs with border walls, with complete impunity. For the last 500 years, European descent people have criminally operated on one white supremacist notion: that they alone can invade and steal non-European lands, that they alone, as a white race, should decide how those lands and peoples of the earth are partitioned with European borders and border walls. They alone, as the white race of Europe, are supposed to divide the world's non-European lands and races to their own European likings. And this right is based upon what authority? Simply because Europeans say so. To do this, European descent people have granted themselves permission to invade non-European lands with extreme violence, to commit genocide against non-European people, to steal land, resources, and freedom. And then, after they have stolen, raped, and enslaved, the European descent people have the monstrous gall to declare themselves to be honorable people, with all the rights to the lands and slaves they have stolen. And they declare that the people they have robbed have no rights to their lands whatsoever. What monsters! Europeans think they can just rob people of their birthrights to land, liberty, and human dignity, and they feel no shame whatsoever for the evils that they commit, no shame for the evils that they have profited from. In fact, get this, they celebrate these evil crimes and declare themselves to be honorable people, freedom-loving people. Whites, Europeans, have decided in criminal fashion that they are not responsible for their crimes of trespassing and land theft simply because it's in the past. But it's interesting to note that they want to keep all the profits from the past. It's interesting that the Europeans want to keep all the lands from the past and the resources from the past. All the crimes of the past are no problem to them as long as they get to profit from the past. Why don't European descent people ever say that they will give up their stolen lands and stolen wealth because, after all, it's in the past and has no relevance to today? Basically, European descent people want the infallible right to steal our lands and then demand that we respect their crimes with borders. Is this what honorable people do? It's evil. It's criminal. It's what monsters would do. And now we come back to the main point, that there are no border walls against white people, against Europeans and their European colonists leeching off stolen lands around the world. If the white race from Europe thinks borders are so sacred, then why didn't they respect the sovereignty and territorial rights of our indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere? White people want the world to obey border walls that they themselves refuse to obey. White people want the world to obey border walls that they themselves refuse to obey. White people want the world to obey border walls that they themselves refuse to obey. If European colonist descendants want to build border walls, they're more than welcome to do so. 1, by moving back to Europe, and 2, by sealing Europe's borders away from the rest of the non-white world. Now that would be a border wall that much of humanity would support. Until then, fuck European borders outside of Europe. This is our continent, and we have the right to be everywhere on our continent. Europeans have the right to be in Europe, and they can have as many border walls as they want there.